Back.
Can everyone hear the speaker?
You can hear me in the back? Okay, great.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
This is Timothy Sheares from the Department of Finance.
Good morning. I'm Timothy Sheares from the Department of Finance. I'm here with two of my colleagues. I have Sarah Welch, who's the data analyst, and Lara Dimnaku, who is the Director of Data Analytics. So we actually had a cloud presentation prepared. Unfortunately, that didn't work, so I guess we were prepared with a PowerPoint presentation. So it's not as interactive as the presentation that we had planned, unfortunately. So we're basically highlighting the tax class 2 rentals for our calendar year 18-19. So this here slide is just a summary of tax class 2 rentals in the city of New York. These are the assessments that will be on the roll starting in July 1st of 2018. So the total number of tax class 2 rental parcels are 23,998, roughly 24,000 parcels for fiscal year 2019, which accounts for over 1 million residential units citywide. The citywide tax class 2 rentals saw a market value increase of 11% for fiscal year 2019. And of this increase, new construction and renovation of rentals accounted for $5.3 million in market value. Brooklyn had the greatest increase in market value, 17.5%, and the greatest increase in assessed value of 22.5%. So this is a snapshot of tax class 2 rentals by borough. So you see on the left column, it's a full market value. Manhattan, over 75 billion. Bronx, 10 billion. Brooklyn, 19.6 billion. Queens, 13.3 billion. And Staten Island, 552 million. So the growth from 2018 in Manhattan was 8.63%. In the Bronx, is 10.65%. Brooklyn, 17.45%. Queens, nearly 16%, and Staten Island, nearly 9%. We are noting that Staten Island, that you're going to see a number of new construction and more class 2 parcels coming along in Staten Island. The assessed value in Manhattan is 25.5. In Bronx is 3.2. Brooklyn, 6 billion. Queens, 4.5 billion, and in Staten Island, 179. Growth of total parcels. It's 9,000 for the 9,800 for the borough of Manhattan, 4,700 for Bronx, 6,167 for the borough of Brooklyn, 3,000 in Queens, and 181 in the borough of Staten Island.
Is this just when they get their GCO?
No, this is when we basically put them on the roll. So yes, you can officially say yes.
They're completed buildings.
These are completed buildings. So you can see the growth in percentage below. And then the total number of residential units at the bottom is, you can see Manhattan leads all boroughs with over 400,000. Bronx has 208,000. Brooklyn has 238,000. Queens has over 159,000. And Staten Island has slightly more than 9,000. And the growth for 2018 is below that. So it's not a great deal of growth in the overall growth of residential units. Next slide is the smaller For the 10-unit family rentals, we classify them as tax class 2A and tax class 2B. Tax class 2A are the 4 to 6 unit buildings, and tax class 2B are the 7 to 10 residential unit buildings. So the total number of tax class 2A and 2B rentals is 53,996, close to 54,000, which accounts for almost over 287,000 residential units citywide. This group saw market value increase of over 12%. For tax class 2AB rentals, Brooklyn had the greatest increase in market value of 14.3%, but the Bronx had the greatest increase in assessed value at 13.3%. Typically, this group this group of properties are not required to file an RPIE. All right, many of their assessed values it's not, mainly because they are less than 10 units. But some do voluntarily file, and so that's the number on the bottom. So 2A, we get about 1,365 filers, and for 2B, 2,253 filers citywide.
Do we know what percent of all 2As and 2Bs those numbers reflect? So like that's 1,365?
Yeah, so it's about 4,000 out of 53,996. So it's a small
I got it.
percentage, right?
Thank you.
Like what, 1%?
4,000 over 54,000? So it's like 2%?
Yeah.
Is there any way of knowing what percentage of those are rent-stabilized units?
I'll find out, but I would gather that a very large percent are rent-stabilized units. So here's the tentative roll for tax class 2A and tax class 2B rentals by borough.
Timothy, before you go on, so what do you do with the filings of those buildings who do file? Do you use that in any way to assess, or is it?
Well, we use a different valuation methodology for tax class 2A and 2B parcels than we do for tax class 2,
Right.
which is 11 units or more than 10 units.
Right.
So the methodology for valuing tax class 2A and 2B, we use a gross income multiplier.
Okay.
So
But do you feel like, because it's not a very large percentage of the buildings, is that
it's
data?
harder to gauge the expense levels, which is why the gross income multiplier pretty much excludes expenses in its application. It's a gross income times a multiplier. So the expenses are not factored in that valuation.
So do we think that the filers, the 2A, 2B filers, do we have any reason to believe they're representative or not representative of 2As and 2Bs? And a related question is, are 2A and 2B filers, are their expense reports, do they increase over time significantly differently than other 2s?
We probably haven't looked at that, to be honest with you, in terms of the expenses and whether they increased over time. We find that the income is probably, for some reasons, more representative than the expenses. The expenses seem to be very all across the board, whereas the income is a little bit in tighter ranges than the expenses are.
I mean, that class though would have people who are owner occupiers, who they over-improve their property versus people who are.
Maybe in the 2A category, but but that's still a smaller population of those who, the number of owner-occupied units in that classification. We can sort of tell that from those who file for exemptions, that the number of owner-occupied units are very small in class 2, particularly in 2B, which is the 6 to 7 to 10 units. The 2A, 4 to 6 units, it's still a small population of owner-occupied units. So here again are the overall numbers for tax class 2A and 2B rentals by borough. This time I'm just going to go vertically in Manhattan, you see you have a market value of 21 billion growth, slightly close to 13%, 12.86%. Assessed value, 3 billion. Growth from year to year, close to 7%, 6.84%. The total parcels are 7,707, and that's a small increase. And the total residential units in Manhattan is 50,446. In the borough of the Bronx, it's slightly over 2.9 billion. The growth is almost 9%, 8.97%. Assessed value is 431 million. The growth from 2018 is 13.25%. Total parcels are 4,407. Growth is slight. Total number of residential units is 22,812. Do you have any questions on this slide? Because I mean, you can see the numbers if you have any questions. If not, I'll move on. The real property income and expense. So, as you heard earlier, owners of income-producing properties with an actual assessed value of more than 40,000 on the 2018-2019 tentative assessment roll must file a real property income and expense statement, or they can claim an exclusion. So, for example, if I just purchased a property and I don't have a full year, say I purchased a property late in 2017 and I didn't have a full year's income and expense, I can file an exclusion. I have to file, but I have to file a claim of exclusion because I don't have a full year of income and expense information. So who does not have to file an RPIE claim of exclusion? Owners with properties that have an actual assessed value of 40,000 or less. Residential properties containing 10 or fewer dwelling units. Tax class 1 or tax class 2 properties with 6 or fewer dwelling units and no more than one commercial unit, and special franchise properties. Special franchise properties are utility properties. You may say, how many properties have assessed values less than 40,000? It's important to note that in that 2A, 2B category, their assessments are capped, which is why many of their assessed values remain under 40,000. Their assessments are capped at 8% a year and 30% over a 5-year period. So many of them remain with assessed values less than $40,000. So here is a
Back
step.
to that one, just mechanically, with the 30%, so could they be 888, and they get to 24, then a 6, and then it just goes flat?
And then it's a 0. So it's roughly 8, 8, and 8. She said
Yeah.
4, but it's compounded. So it's
Yeah.
actually less than
Yeah.
6 that last year because it's compounded, and then 0 in the 5th year.
Yeah, okay.
So on the left here is the income by borough, median income per square foot. So you can see income levels in Manhattan over the last 3 years, from 2013 to 2016. Same for the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. So you can see Manhattan leads the charge in income. The other boroughs are generally either $20 or more, or $20 or more. Median expense per square foot, right-hand side here. Again, Manhattan leads the charge in the greatest expense per square foot, followed by the borough of Queens.
Why are the numbers so low in 2016 compared to the previous 3 years for median income per square foot?
I'm going to have to get back to you.
It just seems like a big, it seems like in the Bronx, it's like almost half. It's like,
No, but even in Manhattan, the number
Yeah, yeah,
declines.
it
I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I apologize.
And Timothy, just to clarify, the expense doesn't include taxes, real estate taxes, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
The expenses do not include the real estate tax. So the number of filings are below at the chart on the bottom by borough from 2013 to 2016. So we receive RPIEs annually. This time we receive them for June 1st of every year for the previous calendar year. Thus, for this year, we'll be receiving RPIEs on June 1st for the calendar year of 2017. So on June 1st of 2017, DOF received RPIE reports for calendar 2016. Income and expenses reported need to be trended because we value as of a certain day. So we value as of January 5th. So the fact that the income and expense information is lagged, we have to trend that information to the taxable status date. So in income, we consider the percentage of owner occupancy. We also consider vacancy. So there's a maximum vacancy amount that we allow. Expenses, we provide reserve for replacement per apartment unit. That's an added expense to the filed expense. And we make adjustments for extreme expense ratios for each income level. There's a maximum allowed expense ratio.
How does the reserve for credit get determined? Is it standard for all building types, or?
It's standard for, we have a standard for walk-ups, we have a standard for, I think we have established a standard for walk-ups, a standard for elevator apartment buildings. So here are the trend factors that we applied for the 18-19 roll. So for the outer borough, as you can see, there are 6 categories. We have regulated walk-up buildings, regulated pre-1973 elevated buildings, regulated post-73 elevated buildings, unregulated walk-up buildings, unregulated pre-73 elevator buildings, and unregulated post-73 elevator apartment buildings. So we pretty much use a lump sum for boroughs outside of Manhattan, and then a guidelines for the borough of Manhattan. That's what this slide is showing here.
So is the trend factor a percentage increase of reported expense? In other words, are you assuming that expenses are, and income are going up by these amounts? I don't quite understand the trend factor.
Yes, it's a projected, as I said, the information that we provide, that was provided to us by the taxable status date is lagged. So for this taxable status date of January 5th of 2018, we had information available to us for calendar 2016.
Right.
So that's more than a 12-month lag. So we have to make up for that time.
So how do you determine the trend factor?
We use an auto-regressive model. So basically, you're looking at past history to project future. So looking at past income and expense trends to project future income and expense trends.
Thank you.
A couple of years ago, we instituted a short form. So who is eligible? This is a short form for RPIE filers. It's a simpler form targeted for smaller property owners. So it's property owners who actual assessed value shown on the Department of Finance 2018-2019 tentative assessment roll of $250,000 or less can complete a shorter RPIE form, as long as the property is not a hotel. So when you file, you'll be given the option. These are the links to the RPIE on the bottom of the page. So you'll be given the option, if your assessed value is less, 250,000 or less, to file RPIE short form. This slide is the citywide tax class 2 rental expense ratios. So citywide is the chart on top. So for 25, where 25% or less of the units are regulated, these are the expense ratios. So pretty much at the 10th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 90th percentile. So it's 30.55% low, median is 40%, and high is 50%. Greater than 25% to 75%. Units regulated. I'm sorry, that should be 25% to 50%. Greater than 25%, but to 50%. Units regulated. 30.6% is the low. The median is 40%, remains at 40%, and the high is, again, at 50%. In the category of 50 to 75% units regulated, the median is 45%, and in the category 75% or more of the units regulated, the median expense ratio remains at 45%.
So this is based on actual reported income and expense?
No, as I explained, we make adjustments. So this factor, the adjustments and this factors the adjustments that we make, and also the adjustments we make if someone files if their expense ratios, if their expense ratios are, or the itemized expenses exceed our guidelines, we make adjustments. That's adjustments we make. If the itemized expenses exceed our guidelines, we make adjustments. If the overall expenses exceed our guidelines, we make adjustments along with the trending. We make adjustments, but we do make adjustments for our expenses that we believe are underreported. We often look at those too. We have a quality assurance unit that looks at high and low expenses. I explained we have situations, and I cite a building that I'm familiar with. It was an older building that was converted. So it was, I believe it was a loft building that was converted to a residential building. We were noting why were the expenses low. So we continued to increase the expenses year after year. And then we finally did some investigation on the building. And what we found was when the building was converted, the owner, it was maybe like a 16-unit building, the owner had heat and hot water units for each unit in the building. So the tenant was paying the heat and hot water. So we no longer gave that owner that benefit of adding expenses.
With the 25% or less units regulated, does that include buildings that are completely unregulated?
Yes.
All
No.
these numbers include
No,
both? Because at the top it says regulated and unregulated property.
Well, it's how we define, we define regulated and unregulated differently.
Ah.
So our definition of regulated,
So for these slides, regulated is off of a percentage of regulated buildings, and regulated, how we define regulated is more comprehensive. So it includes rent stabilized units and rent controlled units. So we look at the number of units that are regulated and look at the total residential units, and we get a percentage of that. And that percentage is 25% or less units are regulated. These are the distribution, low, medium, and high first row, for instance.
But if you had a building that was 100% unregulated, would it be included?
This is inclusive regulated and unregulated rental property, so it's all
Okay, okay,
like citywide altogether.
okay.
And just to, again, the low is anything below the 10th.
25th percentile is low.
Low is which one?
25th percentile, median, and 75th percentile.
Okay, and the high end is
High is the 75th percentile.
75th. Okay.
So just to understand, I mean, just to, helpful to us, so if you look at the median, I'm kind of just saying this as a question, but I think it's a statement. So if you look at a median of the 25% or less regulated and the median of the 75% or more regulated, we're just talking about a difference in expense ratios of just 5 percentage points. So that's an interesting, and that kind of came up in discussion last year. It's an interesting, you know, it's not a massive difference. It's not insignificant, but it's not a massive difference in terms of an expense ratio.
No, you, either low or high. I mean, if you look at low, median, or high,
Yeah.
you find the same thing.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I should mention, we're working with finance to run RPI data with, the percentages are a little different, but buildings with 20% or fewer regulated, 50% or fewer regulated, 80% or fewer regulated. So we're sort of doing the same thing this table is, but the numbers are a little different. So we're close to getting that information right, I think. It wasn't in time for this, but we should have something in April explaining that. So we'll be able to look at those ratios from that data, and that's specific to stabilized apartment building.
So now, this is, the following slides are going to basically be a shot of the boroughs. So this is a similar data for the borough of Manhattan. So here you do see a change
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
median
Yeah.
for the also the 75% or more units regulated compared to those at 25% or less regulated. And this is just a snapshot of the borough of Manhattan by neighborhood. So interactively, we were going to be able to tap on each neighborhood and show you these numbers, how it impacts on the neighborhood level. This is the borough of the Bronx. The numbers are pretty much similar across the board here.
Yeah.
25%, 25 to 50%, 50 to 75%, and greater than 75% units regulated. Numbers are very similar, low, median, and high. And these are the median expense ratios per neighborhood in the borough of the Bronx. This is the borough of Brooklyn. The range is pretty much tighter here, between low, median, and high, between the percentage of units regulated. And these are the neighborhoods in Brooklyn with different median expense ratios. So the darker the color, the higher the expense ratio. The borough of Queens, again, the numbers are pretty tight in each range. And these are the neighborhoods in the borough of Queens. Staten Island, the range is relatively tight, depending on the number of units regulated, and the neighborhoods in the borough of Staten Island. And that's it. Any other questions?
Coming on. Any questions for our
Is it a fair
speaker.
generalization to say that the higher the rent, the lower the expense ratio? Is that generally true, or do we not know that? So it seemed like in Manhattan, the expense ratio.
It appears that way in Manhattan, but if you also look at the expense on a per square foot level in Manhattan, it's significantly greater than all the other boroughs. So I guess you're providing greater services
Yeah.
for that high expense.
Yeah,
Any other questions? Andrew?
No, I have no further questions for Mr. Sheares. Although I think this was very illuminating, actually. So I'm glad you came.
This is
Yeah,
very
that was
helpful. Thank you so much.
good.
And sorry about the technology. We would have liked to seen the interactive version.
Okay. Next time.
Next time, thank you.
All right.
Well, as soon as the the numbers, goodbye.
So,
Can we turn that off? Thank you. You think so? Okay. Okay, thank you. So one of the questions that we keep grappling with is this whole presentation based on the 1992 audit. And again, when I was reviewing the income and expense study, I was struck by how old the audit is, the fact that we don't have an updated audit, and yet we are presenting and to some extent relying on the so-called audit-adjusted expenses in all of our presentations and in our deliberations. And one of the sort of goals of having the Department of Finance explain its own methodology for dealing with inflated expenses or potentially inflated expenses was to see if there's some way that we can account for potentially inflated expenses in some way other than using this outdated audit. So I'm interested in my sense is that the methodology that's used by the Department of Finance, as I understand it, is fairly complex and seems to be undertaken on a property-by-property basis in terms of looking at what they consider to be appropriate income expense ratios, et cetera. So it makes it a little hard, at least I'm kind of struggling to see how we can adapt or somehow use their methodology to adjust for our own thinking. So, I don't know. Andrew, you've been working with them, so.
yeah, the other thing we asked them to do is run the RPIA data excluding the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile. So you're going to get the expenses that are abnormally low, and you're going to get the expenses that are normally high, and they ran that for us as well. They're still running some additional data on that.
Okay.
So I'm hoping that mirrors a little bit. The only issue, there's one little issue we got to figure out, because when they go to the 90th percentile, if their expense ratio is 90th or above, they then bring it down to the highest, which is the 90th percentile. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what we're mirroring, but we will be able to see, well, if we exclude those two sides, the low and the high, we can see where the ratios are out after that, which would I think be a better indication of what we present, because we're eliminating those higher expenses and the ones that are
And low expenses.
right. It may all work out the same in the end. I'm not sure, but we are still trying to get to that point. So, and I think we're close again with them. So we should have more information in April.
Are we,
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, are we accounting for the time differences? Because their RPIE data is from June.
No, we don't. We
1st.
don't do any of their projection
Brandon?
going forward. Yeah, we're just dealing with that calendar year.
And
I
you're
think
looking
it'd be
at,
hard enough to just deal with that instead of trying
and you're looking
to,
at the data for 2016, or are you looking at the data for last year, 2016?
No, it's 2016. It's all 2016
Okay,
data.
so it stays in
Yeah,
the same
we're not
year.
merging data years. That's a
Okay.
good question. No, we're not. So.
Kathy, on the issue you said about the 1992 audit, that audit was conducted by finance,
Correct.
Yes.
and they have no plans on updating that? And would it make sense for us to write a letter from the board saying that this doesn't seem that it's necessarily reliable, and we would request that they would do this?
We could try to request more audits. My
They have,
trivial discussion with them, they don't do traditional audits like they used to anymore. So I'm not sure if they're capable of doing that. That's my understanding. Maybe I misheard them say that. But their way to audit now is to look at data that they have, and he gave that example of, well, what's going on here?
yeah, it's very ad hoc.
Now we're not going to make that adjustment because that's no longer one of your expenses. That's sort of how they deal with it now, instead of saying we're going to go out and audit buildings to see if they're reporting correctly. They have so much data that they think is correct. When they see the outlier, they go to them and say, what's going on? And I think that's how they deal with it, instead of doing individual building audits. Back in the 80s and into the early 90s, before all this data was available, that's what they did. They did audits. So it's my understanding they've sort of gotten rid of that, but I can try to discuss
It was a
that.
long period of time before they actually noticed, which I feel like is even more problematic. So it was
Before they investigated,
right
yeah.
before they were like, oh, why is this continue to happen? Instead of like, it wasn't the first year. It was
Right.
like years. Were
They
going
just adjusted.
by, and they just kept adjusting.
Yeah, they were
it,
just
so.
adjusting it, and they, realized that in that situation they shouldn't have. But we
Well,
could write a letter and inquire.
Let me ask it maybe a slightly different way. So I'm just thinking, is this garbage in, garbage out? So is this good information, or do we have reason to suspect that it's not good information? And if we have reason to suspect it's not good information, even if we can't make them do it, we could at least make the issue clear.
Which information is not good, though?
Well, the question is whether, as I understand it, is whether the RPIE reported expenses are reliable. Because what we have been saying in past reports is we believe, based on this audit, that they are inflated by 8%. And we've used that 8% number, what we call the audit adjusted number, in order to compute the ratios.
Which I don't think is a necessarily bad thing, because they recognize people over-report expense, right?
But we have no-
We're just not sure if it's that 8%. So what we're trying to do with this new set of data is, if we take even further outliers out, we're taking the reported data that we feel is more accurate and working with that, instead of including all the data.
Well, it's not so much a matter of accuracy as, all they're doing is eliminating outliers.
I mean, if landlords systemically over-report labor data, labor costs, whatever, just and without an audit, you would never know. So in other words, it's relying on the representations of the landlords as a class.
Right, which they have 92% of that representation. So they feel that's a very strong, accurate amount, which it is. So if they're jumping out of that outlier, that 92%, then they make the adjustment. They don't need to do an audit. They're saying, okay, you're over-reporting expense. It should be at this ratio. They're just making the adjustment.
They're kind of constantly auditing in a way.
Yeah, I mean, the RPIE, in a sense, is their audit, right? So if you get, representation of 92% of the buildings out there, then that's very reliable. That's what they should be operating on.
I just have a very hard time relying on a 1992 number of 8%
Right,
across the board.
I think in the INE, maybe the better way to look is the trend over time. So if you see ratios trending downward, whether they're audited or not, they take the same thing. So the ratios are either going down or going back up. in recent years, those ratios have been going down, whether they've been audited or unaudited.
Right.
It's more of that
We
trend that
present
you're
both.
watching. Health of a building certainly depends on that ratio. If someone's operating at 64 cents on the dollar toward expense versus 59, that is something that's different, and you should consider that. But you can also look at the trend of both, and the ratios in recent years have been going down.
So theoretically, over time, owners are spending fewer cents on the dollar to operate their buildings, and which is reflected in the increase in NOI. But by how much? I mean, that's, we don't really know when we're talking about the specific audit-adjusted number, whether that number is accurate.
But I certainly do think the trend is accurate, and that's my
Okay.
point. So because we're showing both. We're showing both, and they take the same trajectory if you look at that graph on page.
Well, they will, because we're just making an 8% adjustment. I mean, you're
Right, and the ratio,
That's no
I
surprise.
don't want to dismiss what the health of a building based on that ratio, but if you look on page 9, that chart, they mirror each other in their trend, and I do believe that trend is very accurate.
Isn't that just a result, though, of just applying 8% across the board? I mean, we've just,
Right, but either way, if you're doing it, if the unaudited is going in that trend, then that's the trend, and we were just reducing it by 8%, so those are going to follow, but that trend, I think, you were reporting the unaudited number, so there's the trend. The ratios in current years have just been going down. Again, whether that, you're starting with an unaudited number or
You're just saying because you're comparing apples to apples, the trend line is.
is always going to be the same, right? Because you're reducing it by 8%, but the trend itself, I think, is an indication that owners' operating ratios are going down.
but we would see that even if we didn't, if we
Right,
just
that's-
simply
that's my
excluded
point.
the audit-adjusted number, and we believe it's, I mean, to the extent you're relying on the trend for some sort of sense of validity, it just strikes me, I just question why we keep using this audit-adjusted number at all.
Well,
I know that complicates then year-to-year comparisons with, prior reports and things like that, but it's just,
Well, I think the only thing I could say is from what finances says, there is over-reporting. So to just simply say that it's the unaudited number, that's why, I guess it's making that point.
And the 8% is a number that who came up with that 8%?
That's from the audit. That's what they found when they audited 86 buildings or whatever it was, that they were over-reporting by 8%.
So if that's
On average.
currently happening,
On average.
or if it's happening some years and not others, we would not have good data. Because the trend would be different, no? Well, I guess between them two wouldn't be different, but
But it's still, the data is always raw data. So that's how we've always used it. The data's not changing. It's raw data. They don't do anything to it. They don't make any adjustments. That's what owners are reporting. So if they've reported 8% more in a year or 10% or 6%, it's still what they reported. It's still, the data is still the same. It's still the same way they report, because it's unaudited data. It's just raw data.
So just to understand, so what this means is landlords report their expenses. There was an audit 25 years ago that said it looks like they over-report their expenses by 8%, so we're going to add 8% to that number, and we'll assume that over time that they over-report at the same rate. That's effectively what we're saying.
That's effectively what we're saying with the unaudited.
And so that doesn't sound so terrible, but you're comfortable with this number because it's just the best that we can get, or you seem pretty comfortable with the number. So why are you so comfortable with it?
No, I'm comfortable in the sense that the audits are old, right? So I'm not sure it's 8% anymore.
Okay.
So
it could be more.
Right, maybe I'm uncomfortable with that number, but I'm not uncomfortable with the fact that reporting that, because finance says owners over-report expenses, there is some over-reporting. So the raw number we get is, if that's what they're saying, that's the high watermark of what their ratio would be, because it's
Right.
unreport, it's raw data. They don't do anything with it.
Yeah.
Finance is adjusting it, so they're adjusting it downward, the expense. They're adjusting downward.
But we don't have any way
Some
of,
sort of downward adjustment,
Yeah.
whether it's the 8% every year, I don't know, but we're trying to get new data to better reflect that. But
but it's not across the board. I mean, they're doing it on a building-by-building basis, essentially.
well, as the building is reported, but it is across the board that if they're in the 90th percentile or higher, then they just go,
Right.
they set the 90th. So from that standpoint, they're not looking necessarily individually. They're looking at, this is what this large group is saying this, so we're going to adjust it to what we believe is the accurate number, because this is,
But it sounds like they're not
Majority of the
making
data.
any adjustment to 92% of the reported numbers.
well, they do make adjustments, so that's my point.
Even for those who are not the outliers.
No, if they're within that 10 and 90, then they don't make adjustments. They're taking on face value that that's what the report is. And that's based on the fact that they have hundreds of thousands of,
Well, they're
Bill-
apparently
of
basing
units
it on
reporting
an
thousands of
assumption that if you're within a certain range, you're likely not over-reporting. I mean, that's really what they're saying, I mean, as I understand it. I mean, you may be over-reporting, but they're tolerating it. You know,
You would tend to think that landlords would want to over-report, right? That would be their
Yes.
that would be generally in
Right.
their interest to over-report. So, and then we don't have any sense for 25 years as to the extent of their over-reporting. And so I guess the question is there any possible way to push them, or at least to identify the issues so that we know what we're taught, like, that we don't treat it as God's given truth about expenses, or is this just a kind of a fool's errand, I guess? That's the question.
But it is counterintuitive in that taxes have gone exponentially in the period where expenses are going down. So if they were really incentivized to cook the books, they would have, as every year the taxes gone up, increased their expenses to try to play that game. It doesn't seem to match that.
But you would,
pattern.
I mean, you would actually, you would have to
oh, okay.
expand.
You
You
know what I
would,
mean? It doesn't match the fact pattern of what's going on in the market.
but you probably wouldn't pad your
Tax expense.
verifiable expenses like taxes. You would pad your other expenses.
I know, but
But
they're
that's-
going down, why
right.
taxes are going up, so
but that's much, that's
do that maneuver.
actually much harder to do than it used to be. RPIEs are very specific now where you
Yeah.
can put things.
Yeah.
Part of it may have been interpretation of the like what's a miscellaneous expense.
Right.
There were
And that's been eliminated to a
thousands
large
of,
extent.
not that, but there were 50 or 60 or 70 different expenses they would think they put in there. Now they've defined it as 5 different expenses that go in miscellaneous. So they are basically telling you what goes into every expense category now, much more than they used to. So I think it's tightened the reporting up. I don't, whether over-reporting, you want to say an owner is over-reporting because they're trying to reduce the tax burden. Maybe some are doing that, but there's a good portion that are over-reporting because of misunderstanding how to report. So you can't just say that they're over-reporting to over-report. So there is some error done by the owner, but not.
Yeah. The other thing is that
Purposely.
this tightening up of the miscellaneous category was in response to the findings of the audit, as I understand it, because that was the category in which they found the most problem of over-reporting of expenses. So the other argument is that 1992 audit figure has been corrected for by tightening up the way in which expenses are reported. So, which makes supposedly the owner-reported expenses more reliable.
From last year's presentation, this was different. And so if I remember correctly, they gave us a chart-looking thing that had a lot more information. It was really confusing. And the only thing I came up with was that didn't seem like it was super reliable because of the way the categories were broken down, and how, like, you know, I think that your point of earlier, like if you're in the 90% percentile, you just kind of stay there. And so I do feel like that, I think, is, I mean, I don't know. I was really comparing this presentation to last year. This was a lot easier to help digest. But my understanding from last year is that all those concerns are still probably always going to be true. That it's not going to, it's not super accurate. Even their accuracy of like the outliers was like, I was like, what do you mean you're discarding all of those and you're discarding all of these and you stay with this and you're assuming that people understand what they're filling out. And so all of that is like human error, which I don't know if it's intended or not intended, but I think to your point about whether it's all amazing data and how we should be basing everything we do on, I think it's probably true.
Well, I think we should think about for future studies whether we want to have a kind of different presentation of this, where we could talk about that we have historically done it this way. There's some, reason to, not to continue doing that, and maybe to, if we have, if this information we're getting from DOE helps us, maybe there's a way of presenting that we can come up with some other formula at least to suggest adjustments, if at all.
Well, the data presented in this report is very representative, though, of buildings. I don't think that we should dismiss. This is very good data. We're talking about one part of it, which is the ratio, but it's reported by, thousands of buildings and hundreds of thousands of units, so it's very good data. I don't want to dismiss it just because we're focused on the unaudited thing, and I understand we have to solve that problem, but the report itself is, I think, very representative of what's going on, because there's so much data here, right? Unless you think all data that's reported is garbage, but it's not.
I wasn't suggesting that at all. I was just suggesting that to the extent we are, presenting this audit-adjusted number as, some sort of valid number, I just have problems with that, given that we don't have a current audit and we don't have a methodology based on what DOE is actually doing, that would give us some sort of formula or indicator of how to adjust expenses. So, but I guess we should wait and see what we get on this RPI. It might turn out that even when you take out the outliers, we're basically in the same place, in which case it's kind of moot.
Yeah, I don't, we'll have to see. I mean, we haven't run the data yet, but I think it will help shed some light on it. I'm hoping that's what we're asking for.
So Andrew, just to understand the data going in, so somebody provides the form. Is this completed by their accountant or by the building manager? And is it, do they certify something this is true and correct, or is this just they certify it and the principal does, or an accountant, or?
The other thing is a lot of people using a short form, and I don't even know. I'm going to look and see what the short form involves, but I don't know how detailed the short form is.
I mean, we could show you the workbook. It's all done online now, so I can't go into the online site and start doing the form because I don't own a building. So, but they do have something called a workbook or a worksheet. That's a paper document, and I could send that around, and you could see what expenses are included, what aren't, and what the owners are told to report.
And so when we file our taxes with the federal government, they correlate our 1040 with our 1099s and our W-2s. Does the Department of Finance cross-check any documents? We don't know. So we just don't. So we just don't know how good this data is. We just don't know. I mean, it may be very good, but we just don't have a great sense.
Again, if you get 92% compliance and you come up with, we're taking everything in a group here, I would think if there's so much reporting that the data is good. I don't,
Unless there's a systemic reason to
unless there's a
over-report.
systemic thing that everyone, which I don't think they feel that, and I think that, they make adjustments based on the large majority of people who are reporting. It's when you have that much data, you can recognize
Trends or patterns,
what's
I think.
incorrectly reported, and I think that's.
So unless, as you say, there's a systemic trend to over-report.
We wouldn't know that if it hasn't been audited in 25 years.
That's right.
And I
There's
mean,
some
yeah.
crazy change that happened. I mean, there's a lot of things that have happened in just the city in 25 years, in 10 years. So I do feel like that might.
But I think what Scott is saying is interesting, is that if there's a systemic bias toward over-reporting, why is the trend of expenses going down? That doesn't make sense intuitively.
Well, it depends on if incomes are going like this, and it depends on the rate of change of income versus the rate of change of expenses. So if you know that I'm just thinking this through. I'm not saying this is what's happening, but if if rents are going up rapidly, and you're a landlord, and you may want your expenses to go up rapidly, but it may not go up as rapidly as your rents.
We know that's not happening.
We don't.
We know that expenses and rents are not going up proportionally, just because of the way, just based on the studies.
Well, except that
Yeah.
if the expense information is not reliable, then if one of the two variables, if we feel that there's potential unreliability, then I don't know if that's, we don't know. I don't know. If one of the two main data points going in, we have a sense that there could be some significant unreliability, that now it's 16% or now it's 0% of over reporting, then we just don't know.
I would caution using unreliable. I think this data is very reliable. I think that it's very reliable. What's in
No, it's
question
the 8, we're only talking about the 8%. We're not talking about the data itself. We're talking about whether making an adjustment, at least that's what I'm talking about.
Right. Wait, which we're trying to.
But when you
figure
say the
out.
data is reliable, so the landlord submits a form and it lists a bunch of expenses, and these are self-representations by landlord as to what their expenses were. And you're saying but it's just
within a box, though. They have expenses that don't qualify for it, that aren't counted.
right. No, I understand. But so which one?
Representative of all.
So, but if it's not like a 1040 where your W-2 is checked and your 1099 is checked, then we don't know if we haven't cross-verified it with other data sources, right? So it's just self-represented. It's just data submitted by landlords, and you're saying in the aggregate, this class of people will generally tell the truth.
I'm saying that if you look at the forms and you're taking a large majority of them and finding the outliers from that large majority, then I think that it's reliable data. I don't think owners are out to fill the form out wrong. I don't see that. Some may, but
See what certification people are making. If the CPA is making the certification, let's find out. Has the city brought action against people who falsify these forms? I think the answer to that is no, that people have not falsified the forms and had action brought against them, but
plus
question. But that's the question before making the
I
assumption.
think a perfect example is the price index measures these, right? It's completely different. We're doing a different thing. We're measuring expenses. In the recession, they reported very different expenses because that's what they did, right? And if you take out those 2 years, the PIOC and the INE have been pretty accurate. And so we have this sort of check with the
cross-check,
price
sort of.
index. That's what's going up with expenses. So we're cross-checking it with something that's completely independent. It-
Independent
no.
of owner representation.
So I feel like the data in it is good. I think what we need to do is get to the bottom of the audit, whether we should be using it, we shouldn't be using it. Maybe using data that eliminates the 10th and the 90th percentile is more accurate data, because then you're getting the outliers. Then there's as many, there are over-reporting of expenses, but then there's under-reporting of expenses as well.
Well, that's why we
So
sort
that's
of
why
need
they
to
throw
see
out
how it
the
affects
10th
the
percentile
numbers.
too.
Yeah.
So
Right. But
That's still
That's another
right,
issue.
but
that's-
that shouldn't
yeah.
change the.
Yeah.
that we don't even try to analyze, right? I just I think it's the idea of understanding this, but I think the data set is very,
Okay,
very-
Do you know what number of folks fall in the 90th and the 10th percentile?
the number of
The
buildings.
outliers?
We have to see when we get,
Like,
yeah.
when we're excluding that, what are we left with? Is
Right.
it like, I don't know. I have no
Yeah, I can.
yeah, how
I
many
can let you
units
know.
and, you know,
I'll let you
I
know
would- I
that.
would feel like we would maybe want to take that into account if we're making a shift. Because we might want more units represent, like, I don't know what we would want to use. Do we want more units represented, or do we just want what we think is accurate, more accurate data without like taking into account, like, yeah.
No, that's a good point.
Maybe another way of saying this is just, can we, at least for some of us, need to reverse engineer? So we take this number, but we want to reverse engineer it to understand how this number was constructed so that we feel that we can, that we feel it's accurate. So like kind of what's the formula that gets us to the number that we end up using, and is the data that went into that formula reliable? I mean, but I'm just thinking it through for myself.
okay, well, a work in progress. Thank you, Andrew. Any further items of business?
Usually, I bring this up at the beginning of the hearing, but I think we've lost some folks. But just our commitment for the upcoming hearings around interpretation. I don't think we had ever landed on time limits for folks to speak. If we were leaving that at 2, or we were increasing it and allowed people to speak for longer. I know that we brought up the fact that we said that we would have laptops for people to register for our listservs, but we've only been doing the little pieces of paper. So I just wanted to have a discussion on
We've always
that piece.
we've always had the laptop at all the public hearings.
Right, but it's never been out, like, for
No,
people
it's
to
been
actually
there.
sign up.
No,
It's
it's
been
been
like
there.
facing staff, not like, hey, you can come and actually sign up right here.
Well, the staff does it for them.
There's a sign by the slips that says come to the desk when you're signing up. Not leaving a laptop out.
Well, I'm not suggesting you do, but I think that, like, making it, I don't know.
There's a sign by the slips that says to come to the desk.
Okay. I think that we should rethink about, like, encouraging folks to sign up for the actual updates. And then we had talked about inviting DHCR and HPD to come to the hearings and
Yes.
having
Yeah, they're-
representation there.
HPD, I have to just double check with them, but they were committed, and I think we have to talk to DHCR. They're coming on the 5th, right?
Yeah, I know HPD is committed to doing it. They have a
Yeah.
new unit, so they're planning on coming. The HCR, I can't. I gotta talk to them more about it, but hopefully they'll be
I
willing
mean,
to do
they
it too.
come to workshops in the Bronx with 30 people, so I feel like they would. I think if we push them hard enough, they will figure out how to get somebody there. And then
How
I
do you
just-
deal, I mean, do you know who is in charge of sending out, sort of community representatives? I mean, maybe
have
we,
contact?
maybe you should talk to Andrew
Right.
about, maybe that's who we should be just working with directly, because if that's their mission, they might be a little more,
No, I think them being there would be helpful.
And
Yeah.
we met with, like, recently with some changes around MCI reform stuff that we're working on with the deputy around them doing more community outreach and engagement, so we can encourage them to use this as an opportunity to do that.
well, if you
also.
have some contacts, that would probably be helpful, just because my experience has been that, within a bureaucracy, if there's a unit whose job it is to go out into the boroughs or whatever, that they're more likely to say yes than necessarily, someone at the top of the hierarchy.
Right. And then I just wanted to stress the importance of making hearings really inclusive and welcoming for both landlords and tenants, but I want to speak specifically for police presence. And so if, Andrew, you remember when we held the hearing at Hostos, there were about 30 police officers outside the hearing when folks arrived, barring people from coming in. And we hold our gala in that space, and so I know that the security could be really stringent or really lax, depending on how we have that conversation. When I asked the 44 precinct on why they had so many officers there, they said that they were called by the people holding the hearing and asked to show presence there. And just to put into perspective, a large majority of our members don't have great interactions with police, and it is a really contentious space for them, seeing that many police presence in the space, and they tend to leave. Even at community board hearings, when they've had the hearings around the rezoning, we lose half of our folks. And I do want to encourage us to think about that in the climate that we're currently in and the heightened fear that folks have with what's happening in the federal level, but also how we behave as a city and how inclusive we are at hearings. So I just want to make sure that that's something we're talking about and thinking through.
Yeah, I off the top of my head, I don't remember asking for it. It may have been Hostess that asked for that. I'm not sure. I generally don't ask for, I don't ask for police presence at hearings, but we can have that
hold our
discussion.
gala there for 250 people, and Hostos has never asked for security at night with alcohol presence. And so I do feel like if we can have that conversation earlier, so that folks, if you remember how they were standing in line, barring people from even looking into the entrance of the building.
Right.
And
No,
the
I
only
do.
way that they
And
came
I
out
know-
was when you came outside and told them that it was fine for people to go inside the building.
I think part of the reason what was making them skittish was the size of the space. But we are in the main theater now, so that's 800 people, I think, versus the 300. So I think a lot of that will be eliminated because we have much more room.
Well, maybe we should have a
And I think
conversation with Hostos
Yeah,
about
no, we
just
certainly can.
what they're
Officers
planning.
are there are technically police officers. They're school safety, and so if they aren't told like you're going to have a crowd of people, just don't be afraid of what's happening. They are going to call for backup. They are going to say, "Oh, people are going to feel unsafe," or they feel unsafe. I have no idea what the situation is, but I do feel like we have to address that before. And I think that's true for the Brooklyn hearing that happened also, right? People were coming towards the hearing, and there were 6 police cars just parked outside with their lights flashing, looking at folks, and folks were intimidated by that presence. And I do feel like there is something about us making sure that our hearings are inclusive in that way. And like that does mean that we have to interact with other agencies that potentially cause our hearings not to feel that way for people.
The last Brooklyn hearing, there were police officers?
Yeah, they always, normally I come in a little later, so I notice when tenants are, there were 6 police cops, 2 in the corner, 2 in the other corner, and 2 in the middle, and there were some officers inside the building when folks were registering also. Yeah,
But NYPD, not their
right,
security.
not the school.
Huh. I'm sorry, I didn't
Yeah.
realize that.
Well, we
Certainly
should
not what
probably at least have a conversation with our venues about whether they are undertaking, security measures so that we at least know what the expectation is. That's fair.
We do normally notify the precincts when we have large numbers of people gathering, so that they're aware and their behavior is different towards the people who are gathering. So if we're attending a hearing, and even though they're expecting 500 people, I personally call the precinct and say, hey, we're expecting a large number of people, just so you know they're expecting us, so that it's not this weird dynamic where they are thinking that we're coming to do something to someone else, and that they're treating people that way and not like, I don't know, barring them standing in rows, sort of like in militant style, and then people turning themselves away.
Yeah. David, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just had a couple of things just tie up. For the second Manhattan hearing, I would just recommend that we align it with the times of the others, like 3 hours, like 4 to 7 or 5 to 8, like the others. I mean, I just don't know why we need to have an extra long hearing for a second hearing in Manhattan. So that's just a thought. And then Andrew, would you follow up with the Deputy Commissioner from Finance about why the 2016 incomes were so low in that slide? Was that a
Yeah, I'll
mistake,
follow.
or was that a...
It sounded like it was a
Yeah, it
mistake.
just sounded like a mistake, actually.
But I will definitely
if it's not a mistake, we'd want to know that.
Yeah, I definitely follow up. Yeah.
Those are my 2 comments. Oh, and actually, and on Shayla's point, I actually do think that we should think of a mechanism to keep people to the 3 minutes, and whether that's
Well, it's 2 minutes, and I think, I had a conversation with some people from the Rent Justice Coalition, and there seemed to be a consensus that 2 minutes was fine, that it should be more consistently enforced, that reminding people about it at the time they speak would be helpful, because not everybody hears the initial comments that I make about what the procedure is going to be, and that it's important, particularly where there are so many speakers, that we get to hear as many speakers as possible. So my sense is that we stick with the 2 minutes, see how we do, enforcing the time limits a bit more rigorously, and providing more. I've talked with Andrew about having a handout when people come in that remind them about the time limits, and hopefully we'll have a more orderly approach to the time limits. But that's my sense.
Okay, and so I'll just follow your lead, but you wouldn't want to have something that after 2 minutes it kind of has a noise thing.
Well, there's a thing that flashes.
There is a noise thing on the clock, but I guess maybe it's not.
I mean, I think that's, I don't know what behavior we want to have towards people who are testifying, both landlords and tenants. If we just want something to be blaring at them, or just saying, thank you so much for your testimony, actually your time is up. And
Right.
saying, I think being more consistent instead of just being, I think there is something about like recognizing the person, and then like people tend to, because sometimes people are just going on.
Been treated very respectfully, but have not been respectful to the board.
I mean, I don't know what I think that there are like every other data we're looking at, there are folks that come in and say whatever they want to say. I don't think people have overall been disrespectful. We've had hundreds of tenants testify, thousands of people engaged in the process in the last 4 years, and I don't think that that's my sense, that folks have overall been disrespectful.
Well-
I mean, there are some folks who have been, and I think as folks on the board, we all have different analysis of what respect is and how people should behave and shouldn't behave, and I think that that's fine. Right.
Yeah, I mean, we've had situations, Shayla, where particularly when the owner representatives are speaking or making their presentations, like at the votes and things like that, they're just shouted down. They can't even be heard.
That's like not public testimony. That's our ability to manage the room and get our message out. That's different than folks actually testifying. And I want to make sure that we're making that differentiation. The only year that a owner was shut down and wasn't able to give testimony was in the Bronx, and that was the first year that I was on the board. That hasn't happened since. So I want to recognize that even in the Queens hearing, when we had many landlords testify, they all were able to actually speak. And maybe there was some rumbling, maybe there was some chanting, but like overall they were able to speak. And I don't want to like create I feel like we're acting as if like we aren't able to hear any testimonies. The room is in complete chaos, in order to like make ourselves feel like we're having control over the room. Like we're getting testimonies, people are testifying, we're getting engagement more than ever before in the history of the RGB. I think all of those things really matter. And so how do we behave so that we're not like creating now a whole bunch of policies and procedures that are going to keep people from doing that?
My sense is that many people went over 2 minutes, and that it's and that we should come up with a mechanism to enforce the 2 minutes. And I don't know if just telling people to stick to the 2 minutes is sufficient. We could try that. We could try that in one meeting, but I think that if it doesn't work,
Well, I think the conversation I had with these representatives of some of the various advocacy organizations is that if we, continue to have a problem with respecting the rules, then, we have to move to, having a sergeant at arms or, some other mechanism, and that's not something anybody wants. So hopefully, I was encouraged by my discussion with the representatives of the advocacy organizations that they appreciate that there's has to be balance between the advocacy and the process being able to go forward in a respectful way. So, I'm hopeful based on the conversation that I had, and I think we should give it a try without, doing anything more draconian, and see if it works. Any other business? Okay, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
so moved.
A second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Shayla. All right, we are adjourned. Thank you.